let's take a look at two aspects of sensory memory. The first is visual, and what we would call iconic memory. In this case, and this is another one of the many, many experiments that go back, 60 and 70 years sometimes. So some of these experiments are quite old. But as you can see here, Sperling now in a 64-year-old experiment asked people to report letters that were seen flashed on a screen briefly. In the original condition in which all 12 of these letters were shown, participants lost information in their memory during the time they took to report the first few letters. They simply couldn't hang on to them. But, and put another way, even if as they were recalling the display, the information was fading from where it was being stored. So if he had participants signaled to which row they were to pay attention to, then in that case, they tended to perform the report a lot better, and that's called the partial report, as your text alludes to. And he also noticed that if the tone was delayed by 1 second, the participants giving partial reports didn't do any better than the whole report. So there had to be a signal right after the display showed up. And I'm going to show a video right after this one in our folder that actually demonstrates this live from my CogLab software. But as soon as the display shows up, there's an arrow that would be at the top, middle, or bottom. And then if you were given that arrow, you had a better chance of recalling the letters in order. On the other hand, if the arrow were delayed, it tended to nullify that effect because it sort of faded from memory. So it's very difficult to report all three rows. I could report one row if I have an arrow that appears right after because it's preserved in sensory memory and I don't have to go through an exhaustive search of all the letters. Then in tandem with that, they've also investigated echoic memory, which of course pertains to sound. Moray, who we've seen before, found that participants giving partial reports could report more letters in a rather complex design that involved 4 audio channels. Now, it's hard to envision the equipment that was involved or what the particulars were, but there were 4 audio channels. And basically, because participants gave better partial reports than whole reports, this suggests that we store information only briefly and can only adapt a part of it. Other investigators provided evidence that echoes can last longer than icons, perhaps even as long as 20 seconds. But in any case, echoic memory is often interfered with by something called a suffix effect. The suffix effect is something that suggests that having something that comes after something that we're to memorize. So let's say I'm repeating a phone number over and over again on the radio for people to call, and then I refer to the website. Referring to the website could essentially extinguish memory for the phone number, and that would be a suffix effect. The suffix is actually deleterious. It actually gets in the way of remembering what was intended to be remembered because it serves as sort of a bookend that cancels that message. I'll tell you, there's a great example of this every single day, all day, on XM radio, Sirius XM radio. Their advertising is predominantly through phone numbers. And I don't know who the audience is on Sirius XM. It appears to be men between 50 and 75. And there are a lot of ads for Viagra, for tax services, for, real estate investment opportunities, for nutritional supplements, all sorts of things. And they repeat phone numbers over and over again. But occasionally I notice in the ad they go to the website and then go to this website.com. Well, the website.com, just citing it, has the effect of nullifying my memory for the phone number, and that's the suffix effect. So we do see some parallels for echoic memory, but it's also plagued by this other issue of a suffix effect that could kind of negate or serve as a mask of sorts against the audio memory. So sort of a wrap-up sentiment here. Research continues to refine our understanding of both an icon and an echo. There are a few things in common. Sensory memories are modality specific. The visual sensory memory contains visual information, auditory. sensory memory capacities appear to be relatively large, but the length of time information can be stored is extremely short, less than a second. And that's what that Iconic experiment showed particularly. If that arrow appears too long after, if the tone appears too long after we're to see this first row, for example, then it tends to kill the memory for it. The letters are gone too fast from sensory memory. So that's an important aspect of it. Excuse me, I've lost my train of thought here. And then finally, third, the information that can be stored appears to be relatively unprocessed, so it's basically physical. And one last comment. These two authors argued that sensory memory research could have a very practical use outside the lab. Having directory assistance operators say, "Have a nice day," after giving a phone number should disrupt recall for the phone number. It's a disaster. So we shouldn't do that, as the case is for, citing the website on XM radio. And XM is not a very popular product, really. I guess they're profitable, but it's amazing how few subscribers there are. And it tends to be geared, apparently, the advertising towards overwhelmingly older men. But it's amazing how they shout a phone number at you 3 times and then ixnay it with the silly idea of citing the website or saying something else as a sign off. So there are some parallels between sensory and iconic memory, or I should say iconic and echoic memory. And those 3 things are certainly worth committing to memory, as he says sort of in the middle of the chapter, or as Galates says in the middle of the chapter.